I recall some years ago, we had a TV where the picture just all of a sudden just stunk. It was washed out and discolored. And I discovered the problem was not with the hardware of the TV, but the settings. See, somewhere along the line, the default settings for brightness and tint had been set wrong. And so every time you turn on the picture, the picture was wrong. And the fix was simple enough. I simply had to change the defaults back to where they should have been. I thought of that when it came to this passage that we're going to be looking at in Matthew today. For in many ways, this passage is telling us that our default settings are messed up. And because we've lived with it for so long, and in a society that reinforces those settings, most folks don't even realize the problem. For in this passage, Jesus is telling us that the default way that we interact with power and greatness in people within this world, the defaults are dead wrong, and they need to change. And unless you are a perfect Christ follower, spoiler alert, you aren't, your settings probably need at least to be tweaked. Interested? Let's hear the scripture.
Reading from Matthew chapter 20, starting in verse 17. Now, as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside and said to them, "We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will turn him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. And on the third day, he will be raised to life." Amen. When the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons and kneeling down asked a favor. "What is it you want?" he asked. She said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." "You don't know what you are asking," Jesus said to them. "Can you drink the cup I am going to drink?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or my left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called to them and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." As Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed them. 2 blind men were sitting by the roadside, and when they heard that Jesus was going by, they shouted, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." The crowd rebuked them and told them to be quiet, but they shouted all the louder, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." Jesus stopped and called to them. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. "Lord," they answered, "we want our sight." Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight and followed him.
Thank you, Darren. We'll dismiss the kids at this time. All right, Matthew 20. If you have your Bibles and are looking there, that would be great. There are some few Bibles underneath some of the seats if you need that. Let's talk about this passage. Let's talk about what Jesus means when he gives a startling idea of what true greatness in the kingdom is like. Now, as always, a passage can only be understood in its context, so let's begin here. So the context is that Jesus is now going up to Jerusalem. In fact, we're told twice, it's kind of emphasized in verses 17 and 18, that he is going up to Jerusalem. And Matthew, I think, wants us to understand everything else that's going to be happening in light of this. Now, we've been headed here a while, actually. So if you look back, and most of these, Nathan has preached, and they've been great sermons about, you are the Messiah, Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi. And you'll see that on the map there. And then just a little bit north of there, Mount Hermon, where I think the site of the Transfiguration was. Some people would place it differently. But that is up there, the highest mountain in the area. And then you have Jesus return to Galilee. And then Jesus sets out for Jerusalem in Matthew 19, verse 1. And then last week, Nathan preached on Jesus teaching upon the way and giving the parable of the tenants and those to receive the grace of God. Now, what's happening here, though, is that Jesus again predicts his death. So at the beginning of our passage today, Jesus again is telling them that I'm going to go up to Jerusalem and die. This is actually the third time he does this. So he predicts his death right after Peter's great affirmation, you are the Messiah. He predicts it again after they go to Galilee and before they set out for Jerusalem. And here now, they come to Jericho, which is only about 15 miles from Jerusalem. And it's the last city of any size before you go there. So it's kind of the launching point if you were going to ascend to Jerusalem for the festival or whatnot. And again, Jesus predicts his death. Now what's happening here? Well, Jesus is going up, like many others, to celebrate the Passover. The crowd is the crowd has this expectation as well. Right after this, the very next passage next week that we'll talk about is the triumphal entry where Jesus goes in and they're celebrating, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and they wave palm branches, kind of like a ticker tape parade today, because palm branches were a sign of victory, celebration of triumph. Okay, so that's what's on the crowd's mind. And that's apparently what's a little bit on the disciples' mind too. We're going up to Jerusalem, and now the kingdom is going to start. And Jesus wants them to understand, guys, this isn't a coronation. This isn't a coronation. We're going to Jerusalem where I will be killed. And then he adds, and this are details he didn't add previously, I will be handed over by the chief priests. So this isn't some mob action or some assassin. This is a judicial thing by the rulers, the powerful people. I will be handed over to the Gentiles, and by this he means the Romans. And I will be handed then to be crucified. They handed to the Romans because the Jewish people were under Roman occupation, and Rome said, you cannot condemn someone to death. We're going to reserve that particular privilege for ourselves. That's the power we want. So all they could do is the Jewish rulers could condemn him and hand him over, but then Rome had to decide what to do. And Jesus says, I will not only die that way, but it will be a crucifixion, which was the most humiliating and painful death that cruel Rome could ever devise. This is what I'm going to, guys. Now, what's interesting here and amazing, the disciples still don't get the memo or the meaning of it fully. You can tell because right here they begin arguing about who's greatest in the kingdom. Now, why didn't they get the memo? I don't know. I think maybe, Jesus did use hyperbole. He used a lot of figures of speech. So maybe they thought something like that was going on. I don't really understand. This is the third time. But there seemed to be, when it actually happens, less than a week away, they seemed shocked and dismayed. And here they begin this discussion on who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. It starts with a mother's request. It starts with the mother's request. So the mother of James and John, their father's name is Zebedee. We're not told her name, at least here. She comes and asks Jesus for a favor. She's apparently got the two sons here with her because right after this, Jesus is going to address them. So this is apparently the three of them going to Jesus. Now, why did they go through their mother? Well, this part's speculative, but many people feel that the mother of James and John was the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And this is kind of reading between the lines. If you look at the 4 different gospel accounts of the women who were there after the cross, she's one of them. And some people link her with Mary. Again, it's technical, it's not agreed upon, but I think it's more probable than not that she was actually the aunt of Jesus. And so I think maybe the guys are leveraging that for their own request. And here's the request. Grant that these two would sit on your right and your left when you come into your kingdom. Now, this is a remarkable woman in a sense. She's there all the way. She's part of this large entourage that goes to Jerusalem, and she's also part of the very few that stay after the cross and the crucifixion to take care of the body of Jesus. And here she and they display faith, but also misunderstanding. Faith that Jesus will come into his kingdom soon, but also misunderstanding about what it means to sit at his right or left. Now, to sit at your right or left, kind of, we had that phrase a little bit today, someone's right-hand man. So to sit at the right or left in this kingdom means the special places of honor, basically. Now, Jesus looks at the 2 men, James and John, and he says, basically, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink from the cup that I'm going to drink from? What did he mean by that? In the idiom of the day, the cup was the circumstances that God had put before you, or life had put before you, the lot that was before you. And Jesus, when he talks about this, he's referring in particular to the passion, the suffering that he will soon go through. Less than a week later than this, he will be praying in the Garden of Gethsemane before that fiery trial. Lord, if possible, take this cup from me. But nevertheless, not as I will, but as you. That's what he's talking about. Guys, can you drink my cup? Yes, we can, they say. They're both right and wrong. They're right, and Jesus affirms, says, you will drink my cup, because they will taste suffering. And James, at least, death. John, exile, and probably some other nasty tortures along with that for their devotion to Jesus. But it's not yet. It's not this week. Jesus, when he goes before Pilate and the Sanhedrin, he goes alone because the disciples, in their dismay, have scattered off. John at least comes back to the cross sometime later to witness. But they don't drink the cup now. But they will. But he says further, okay, in a way you will. But to sit at my right hand, that's not for me to grant. That's already been prepared by my Father. Now, what's he mean by that? He might mean only, well, this is so out of bounds to talk about the right or left that it's not worth discussing. Doesn't concern you. Or he might have something else in mind that we'll talk about in a minute. Now, the other disciples, when they hear about this, of course, they are full of grace and understanding towards James and John. No, they're not. They get mad too. Why? Well, probably because they view this as some sort of power play. They view it as something that these two guys are trying to get what they want, which is also a position of power. So Jesus looks at them and at us, and he says to them and to us, hey guys, you're thinking like Gentiles here. You're thinking like the Romans. You know how it works in their world. Those who have power lord it over those underneath them. Those who have authority exercise that authority over. And the key words repeated twice there is over. And in the Greek language, it has both of those terms have this idea of a spatial hierarchy. Those above using their power downward to keep other people down, or at least to keep their position up. And that's the way it works in the Gentile world. That's the way it works in the world for the most part. This is the default position I was talking about. That whatever you have, whatever you've accomplished is for you. Whatever position you have achieved, whatever good things you have are for your gain and your glory. And if you engage people, other people at all, If they're above you, you seek to use that to get a little bit higher. If they're below you, then you use that, if possible, to keep yourself above them. How different? The actions of the only one, the only man, the only human, who actually was higher. Philippians 2, let this mind be in you, this attitude, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, you don't get any higher than that, right? He did not consider that equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. And that's the difference. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant by becoming like us so that he could serve us. He lowered himself. And not only that, taking on human form would be lowering enough. But he doesn't come as some great person. He doesn't come as some famous person who's pampered and taken care of by others. No, he comes as a servant. And then he becomes obedient even to death on a cross. I mean, the servant was almost as low as you could go. There's only one rung lower, and that would be a criminal on a cross, humiliated and condemned. And that's what Jesus has done. He has lowered himself. This is the king of this kingdom. And this is what greatness means in this kingdom. So he says, look, the only way to be great in this kingdom is not to lord it over, to exercise over. But if you want to be great in this kingdom, be a servant. Be a servant. Now, we tend to think of that word more generally, but they had a very clear conception of that. A servant was someone who took care of other people's needs within a household. Or, he says, be a slave. About 1/3 of the Roman Empire, the population of the Roman Empire, were slaves, doulos. About 1/3. These people knew what it meant. To be a slave meant that you did not have position or property of your own. You were serving towards someone else. You want to be great in this kingdom? This is how. Remember, this is the very week Jesus goes to the cross. And I can't help but wonder, as John and perhaps James at more of a distance look upon this scene, do you think they realize what it means to be at the right and left of Jesus? Because in many ways, this is the culmination. This is the throne of the King. The Gospel of John brings us out again and again, but Matthew does too. By the way, this ascent is mentioned again and again, like a king ascending to his throne. But that throne is a cross. And those on the right and the left are crucified with him. That's what it means to be on the right or the left. And I wonder if it was this moment that was a fundamental change in their understanding of what it meant to be great in this kingdom. Well, there's one more short story here. And I have to admit, when I first started studying this passage for the sermon, I'm like, why? I mean, you've got this beautiful flow up to Jerusalem. You've got this beautiful passage of Jesus teaching them about serving and giving his life as a ransom for many right before he goes to the cross. And then it seems like this little story about these two blind beggars is an interruption. It interrupts the flow of the narrative. It interrupts the whole procession as they go. And you know what? I think that's kind of the point. I think that's kind of the point. Jesus and the crowd are now leaving Jericho. It's the last settlement of any size before the cross, before the ascent. The crowd is ripe with anticipation. Right after this, you have that triumphal entry scene. But a strange thing happens on the way. Two blind men, likely sitting on the side of the road on their usual spot begging. If you're blind, that's pretty much all you could do. They hear the crowd. They hear the talk about Jesus. They can't see him, though. They don't know where he is. So they begin shouting loudly, Lord, Son of David, which is a messianic title, have mercy upon us. The crowd's a little annoyed. don't these guys see that something much bigger than their problem is happening right now? No, they don't see that, or they don't care. So they keep shouting, which no doubt annoys the crowd more. But Jesus, he stops the whole cavalcade. He stops the whole procession. He stops the whole narrative. And he comes to those two blind men. And he asks them a question. What do you want me to do for you? That might strike us as a dumb question. But I don't think Jesus asks dumb questions. I think he recognizes some people might want to stay unchanged. After all, they probably had lived their whole life begging in this way. In any case, he gives them the dignity of choice. He addresses them and asks them. And they say, we want to see. And Jesus has compassion upon them and heals them. And they immediately follow him as part of the crowd. I found a short video clip that illustrates this passage.
As Jesus and his disciples were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. Two blind men were sitting by the roadside, and when they heard that Jesus was going by, they shouted, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." The crowd rebuked them and told them to be quiet, but they shouted all the louder, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." Jesus stopped and called them. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. "Lord," they answered, "we want our sight." Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight and followed him.
I hope you see who you are in this big net. You and I are those blind beggars. One scholar pointed out on this passage that word had compassion here has more than just this emotional meaning. It seems to describe the whole attitude and act of God in his dealings with mankind through the cross. Jesus stops the whole procession of human history, enters in, addresses us, looks upon us with compassion, and brings healing. I had a question as I was looking at this, like, why did Matthew include this? And it's not enough to say, well, because it happened. I mean, at the end of John's gospel, remember what he says there? He says, you know, if all the things Jesus said and did had been recorded in a book, the whole world could not contain all the books, or all the books. Hyperbole. But the point being that the gospel writers did not record everything. They selected for a purpose what they were going to record. So why did he record this for us? I think two reasons. Number one, to show the difference between those blind men who recognized Jesus, who called out to him in a messianic title and then followed him. They saw what the religious leaders that he was soon to interact with were blind to, though they felt that they could see. It illustrates how the gospel comes to those who are often humble and not regarded by much within this world, while those who are the big shots miss it entirely. And second, these men would be unable to work, unable to produce, unable to achieve. They'd be a drain on anyone's treasures. They brought nothing to the table. And again, that reminds us of us. It doesn't matter where we fall on the scale of human hierarchy. Compared to God, we bring nothing to the table. This is all by grace, this kingdom. This kingdom is a kingdom of grace and mercy and compassion. It's not about worth. It's not about greatness. And I think that's why Matthew includes that here, this key point. Let's talk about some words of application. Let's talk about this here for a second as we begin to wrap up. I had 3 words here of application. And first, getting ahead of myself, I think obviously we are implicitly encouraged to seek the true greatness of the kingdom. It is not wrong to seek greatness. There is a part of us as humans that is exactly what we should be doing. The problem is choosing the wrong kind of greatness and chasing after that, which is what most of our world do. That's where their default settings are. And here we're challenged to a different kind of greatness. Not the greatness of titles and positions and wealth and achievement and reputation, but the greatness of following Jesus and giving of ourselves sacrificially for the good of other people. That is the defaults that we need to change. Second here, don't leave this as a vague intention. Don't leave this as a vague intention. Put a face to it. The face of someone that you could serve today or this week or this month. Not the face of someone that could likely pay you back in some way, but the face of someone who has no claim upon you other than their need in a way that you could serve them. The face of a friend, family member who needs companionship, even though, if you're honest, you enjoy the company of other people a good deal more. The face of a coworker or a classmate who needs help or needs to be honored or lifted up in some way or simply listened to. The face of someone who needs the gospel. This is what I mean. Ask God to show you the face of someone. You cannot serve all the world. And if we leave it as a vague intention, I'm going to be more of a servant towards others, it probably won't change anything, right? But if right now we see, okay, this is the greatness of the kingdom, I'm convinced, I see it in Jesus, help me, God, to understand what that means for me. God will answer that prayer. And then lastly, don't give up. And I wanted to include this because I feel like for many of us, we know this. We've been in church. But we give up living this way towards other people because it doesn't seem to move the needle, at least not very much. Serving in this way is not going to be fulfilling and exciting in the same way that many other things in this world are. There is a fulfillment and a peace and satisfaction that comes. But there is also this weariness that comes because we serve other people, we serve different ministries, we serve in different ways this world. And after a while, we're not sure that it's doing much good. That's common. That's common. And I think I would like to respond to that by a simple illustration of a woman's life as we conclude. This is Veronica Hulick. This picture is taken from her obituary, which also states that she was born in 1923 in Wilmington, Delaware, and she died in 2016, so lived past 90 years. After graduating from high school, she enlisted in the United States Naval Women's Reserves, also called the Waves. After the war, she attended George Washington University and later graduated from Temple University in Philadelphia, where she completed a dental hygienist program in 1948. Ms. Hulick then moved to Washington, where she raised her children and worked for area dentists until she retired and then settled in Fort Pierce, Florida in 1987. A somewhat unremarkable life. And yet, there was something remarkable that she had done, but she didn't know about it for over 40 or even 50 years. You see, Veronica was 20 when she joined the Navy Waves at the beginning of World War II. And those were dark times. At the beginning of the war, Japan was on the ascent in the east, and in the Atlantic, the Germans were sinking more supply ships than we could send over to Europe, sometimes even convoy of men, faster than we could replace the ships almost. She and about 15 other bright young women worked for hours at a monotonous job of wiring red, green, and blue wire to small wheels. They had no idea why. Later, they discovered they helped build a set of Navy computers referred to as the bomb bay, even though the word computer had not been introduced into the American vocabulary. Later, the group was transferred to Washington, D.C. They were all sworn to secrecy, with the consequence of being shot if they leaked out any information about their project. It took about several hundred women each shift to run the 120 computers that they helped to build. And when they got a printout from the computer, they couldn't read it, but rather they ripped off the printout, knocked it on a door at the end of the room, and gave it to a hand that came out only long enough to grab the paper. When the war was over, each young lady was taken into an office and had to swear on the Bible that they would never talk about their work. They were given a letter instructing future employers not to ask about their activities during the war. And it took almost 50 years for her to learn what her noble efforts were doing. In 1994, almost 50 years after the war ended, 80 of these women gathered in Dayton, Ohio for a reunion. And it's then that a Navy historian told them about the fruits of their labor. They had been responsible by building that computer and operating it, a computer which was able to intercept and decode the transmissions of the German fleet and indeed of all their most senior officials. They had been responsible through that of sinking between 750 and 800 German U-boats. And this one thing had helped shorten the war by probably at least a year, he said, possibly up to 2 years. And when you consider that on average in World War II, 7 million people died each year from that conflict, that's a lot of lives saved. Veronica was thrilled at last to be able to tell of her work during the war, but she was grieved for others who died never knowing the huge role that they had played in that war effort. And that's where I want to end this. Because I think one of the things that keeps us from pursuing this kind of greatness is just tiring. We don't see the results. But there will be a day. There will be a day, the day of Christ, when all is revealed. And we may be gobsmacked to see what God did with our simple and persistent acts of service. We're going to sing one more song here as we close. It's called For the Cause. And it's for obvious reasons we're going to be singing this. For the cause of Christ that we want to do this. This is the King that we are serving. This is the King who is a model for us. And as we do this, I encourage you to, again, ask God to show you a ministry or the face of someone that you could serve for the cause of Christ.